Next, we have Stanley Krippner, who will be talking about remembering Salvador Roquet. Stanley Krippner, PhD, is the Alan Watts Professor of Psychology at Saybrook University and Fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Society for Psychological Science, the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, and the Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality. Stanley is the author of dozens of books and articles. He has conducted workshops and seminars on dreams and hypnosis around the world, and has received multiple lifetime contributions and awards. So if you please give a round of applause to Stanley Krippner.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you all for coming to our program this afternoon, and thank you all for coming to Psychedelic Science. As you know, we've been sold out for weeks. I'd like to find out if there's anybody in the audience who actually knew Salvador Roquet. Oh, this is wonderful. This is wonderful. Half a dozen people. Isn't this great? Okay. Well, those of you who did not know him will find out a little bit about him this afternoon. And I think I'm going to need some help with the PowerPoint because it's not progressing. Here we go. Okay, so as you can see, Dr. Salvador Roquet was a Mexican pioneer in psychedelic psychotherapy. He began his medical career in the field of public health and later became a psychiatrist, starting to use mind-altering substances as an adjunct to psychotherapy in 1967 at his Institute of Psychosynthesis in Mexico City. Now, his work in public health is important because this introduced him to indigenous people in Mexico. And when he was with indigenous people, of course, he met the shamans and the sabias and the sabios and the curanderos and the curanderos, and he learned a lot about the way that they conducted indigenous psychotherapy. And he introduced many of those techniques into his psychosynthesis practice. His psychedelic sessions lasted about 8 hours and included patients taking many substances such as LSD, ketamine, mushrooms, and morning glory seeds. And on Monday, some of you might be coming to our all-day session on ketamine. I'll be speaking about Roquet on Monday also, and giving a few other details that we won't have time to do this afternoon. Roquet was widely acclaimed for developing a series of innovative therapeutic methods for using these substances. Yet in today's world of psychedelic psychotherapy, he is relatively unknown. And so I'm glad that at least a few people here are going to be learning about him over the course of our time together. Dr. Salvador Roquet was a Mexican pioneer in psychedelic psychotherapy. He began his medical career in the field of public health and later became a psychiatrist. We've already gone over that material. I received an invitation to visit his institute and accepted his offer in 1972. I was impressed by the way that Roquet orchestrated the group sessions, and so I informed my colleagues at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. They invited him for a visit, following which he became their advisor, working with John Reed, Stanislaus Grof, Richard Jensen, who is his translator, and others. Now, I had planned to give you a description of one of his psychedelic sessions, but I discovered that there's somebody in our audience today who actually was in the session. So Cliff, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like you to tell people what it was like to have therapy in one of Salvador's sessions, okay? Just come right and speak into the microphone.
Hi. Yeah, back in the 1970s, Salvador was doing sessions for the public, and they were weekend and maybe 3-day sessions. So I did 2 of those. They were non-drug sessions. And he put us through a lot of experiences to try to, I sort of replicate the dissolution of ego and kind of breaking apart whatever stuff you're holding on to. So we did like sleep deprivation and spend long periods. He did a lot of really, really intense media stuff, sight and sound, to just kind of break things up for us. He had us take off our clothes, blindfolded, laying on the ground, and massage our bodies, which is a pretty strange experience. And then at the end of that, we would have group sessions. And so I got to know the organizers, and then I got invited to do an LSD session with him. So I did a couple of LSD sessions, and I'll just briefly, I'm just going to be up here for a minute or two, just briefly describe one of my LSD sessions. So we got there maybe around 8, 9 at night, and we talked, and then we took LSD. I think I brought my own LSD. And then we put on blindfolds, laid down on the floor, and then he started playing. Oh yeah, actually before we did that, he did the slideshow also, the intense slideshow, just to kind of sensory assault, really. And then we took the LSD, and so I'm laying there with about a dozen people. Maybe it was in somebody's living room. This was, I think, in Berkeley. And so in the middle of the night, maybe like 2 in the morning, and I didn't know this was going to happen, actually. One of his assistants came up to me and said, Cliff, we're going to give you a little shot of a ketamine, if it's okay with you. And, I'm just like, what are you going to say? So I go, okay. And so they give me a shot of a ketamine, and pretty fast, very fast, I was traveling over Highway 580, out-of-body experience. But what was most amazing for me was I totally lost my sense of identity. I did not know that I was Cliff Bernstein. I didn't know where I lived. I didn't know what I was doing, what I was up to. And that went on for a while. Fortunately, I had had other LSD experiences, so I knew the importance of letting go and not trying to grab on and hold on to your identity and find your identity somewhere. And slowly my identity came back. And then in the morning, as the sun was coming up, then he had us sit in a group, and we did group therapy kind of thing, and he paired me up with another person, and who he thought was appropriate. And so myself and that other person talked, and then we probably left around 10 a.m. in the morning, something like that. So that was a couple of my experiences with Salvador Roquet, and I'll be around afterwards if anybody wants to go into more detail. Thanks.
Well, when I was sitting in on the session, of course, I observed all of these items, but I thought you'd like a first-person account. Salvador had a great sense of the dramatic, of the theater, and his sessions were very, very theatrical. I was in a session where he was working with a young man who had a serious issue with his father, and Roquet had put me right by that young man so that I could see what he was going through, and also I knew enough Spanish to pick up on the dialogue, and so he was telling Roquet, yeah, I wish my father were here right now. I would really tell him off. And then Roquet took off the blindfold, and there his father was right in front of him. And the young man reached over and touched him. Yes, this is my father. And they had a violent confrontation. And I saw all of this right before my eyes and was picking up on the dialogue. I heard both sides of the story. And believe it or not, after an hour of violent confrontation, they were hugging and they were making up, and I saw that young man 3 years later, and he and his father were still reconciled. So, again, Roquet did things in psychotherapy and in his group sessions I've never seen anybody else do, and you got a little taste of it right here. Roquet spoke about his work at the 1975 convention of the Association for Humanistic Psychology. In 1976, he was arrested and jailed by Mexican authorities. He was released on the condition that he abandoned his use of psychedelics. Instead, he used sensory bombardment techniques in both psychotherapy and his workshops, the so-called vivencias. He paid me the great honor of writing me and told me that my letter was very instrumental in getting him out of jail with the Mexican authorities. And I said, well, I wish you had never gotten in jail in the first place. And his problems still were not over, but this is what happens with pioneers, especially in this field. However, he continued to use psychedelics outside of Mexico and was arrested again, this time by U.S. authorities, incarcerated. Once again, my friends and I were instrumental in his release, and he continued his practice of psychotherapy, often taking his patients to ingest psychedelics with indigenous practitioners in Mexico. Now, I actually had two friends who were present in the session where the police came in and arrested him right as everybody was peeking. And the analogy I make often is that this would be just like if the police came in and dragged a priest off the pulpit in the middle of high mass in a Roman Catholic church. People would be shocked. Oh, how sacrosanct, how sacrilegious. No, nobody thought anything about it. The police were just doing their duty. And of course, it freaked the people there pretty badly. Eventually, yes, they recovered, and I'm still in touch with one of the people who was in that, shall we say, that notorious session. I joined one of his groups in 1982, where I met the celebrated curandera, Maria Sabina, and assisted one of her students during an all-night ceremony with psilocybin mushrooms. This is somewhat off the topic, but I became interested in Maria Sabina after reading the 1957 article in Life magazine written by Gordon Wasson, whose grandson is actually with us today, and some of you might run into him during his session. And when I met Maria Sabina, it was a little bit chilly, and I gave her my jacket. There we are with Salvador Roquet, and she's wearing my jacket. That was my gift to her. I also gave her some money. I don't believe in ripping off indigenous people, so I always give them some gift when I come to visit. And then when she heard we were going to take photographs, she put on her weepole, her ceremonial gown, and there she is in her beautiful gown with a daughter and a grandchild. And she said, you know, I'm too old to do the veladas myself, but she referred us to a student of hers, Dona Clotilde Sanchez, and we went to visit Dona Clotilde in her sanctuary, and she said, you know, this is the dry season, and I don't have enough mushrooms to go around. One of you will have to sit it out. And I said, look, I've had the mushrooms before. I'll be happy to sit it out and just observe. She said, oh, good, you could be my assistant. Well, let me tell you, I learned more being her assistant than I would have if I would have taken the mushrooms. For one thing, there were pine boughs all over the floor, and we had to take candles and stick them on the concrete floor, and we had to put a little bit of wax on the floor first and then put the candle in. Dona Clotilde was going bang, 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 one candle after another. Mine, you know, were a little more difficult. And then I noticed the candles that she was using were flat on the bottom. The ones she gave me were rough on the bottom. So I would look bad, and she looked good. Well, that's the theatrical aspect of being a curandera. And I've seen this with shamans in other parts of the world, too. And then she would send me off to work with people who were having some difficult times. And there was a beauty queen, a former Miss Kentucky, who was now in her 40s, and she discovered that she had been coasting on her beauty all of her life, and she had never developed anything interior, and so this is why she was a patient of Dr. Roquet's. And there was also a Mexican concert pianist who had stage fright. He couldn't perform. So I went over and helped them. They were having a very difficult time. They were heaving and vomiting. And then I knew what the pine boughs were for. The pine boughs were to cover up the stench of all the vomiting that was going on. So I went over and listened to them, and one in Spanish, one in English, one on one side, one on the other side. It was quite a challenge. And they really seemed to be working through their issues, and they were so delighted. And they were kissing me, a beautiful woman on one side, a handsome man on the other side. Did I enjoy the kissing? No, because they were so much vomit in their breath that I could hardly breathe with all of the kissing and hugging. So yes, I learned a lot. I learned a lot being the assistant of Dona Catilda that night. Also, one of the members of our group had visions of vampire bats, and he was very alarmed because he had had nothing but good trips before. But I knew a little bit about vampire bats, and I said, Walter, those vampire bats are of quite a history. Yes, they suck blood from people, but then they regurgitate the blood and they give the blood to their children. So you've been a mentor for all of these years, and what the vampire bats is symbolizing is the blood that you're giving to the children. Oh, that made him feel much better, and so he was no longer terrified of the vampire bats. So at the end of the night, who should show up bright and fresh but Salvador, and he did group therapy. He was using an instrument called the Hartman Personality Test. Hartman lived much of his life in Mexico, and he was of a psychoanalytic orientation, but he had designed a questionnaire that was quite helpful. And so I had a chance to see this marvelous group therapy in action. And again, he was orchestrating things. Salvador was such a beautiful orchestrator, and he was able to get information from one person, juxtapose it with information, all in Spanish, by the way, and it had to be translated into English. This is where Rich Jensen came in handy. He was such a marvelous translator for Salvador all of those years that they were working together. So, Roquet passed in 1995, but his work with the Indigenous healers was one aspect of his distinguished legacy. His use of multimedia and psychedelic psychotherapy was a second aspect, and his utilization of ketamine was a third. All three aspects are cited in the book, The Ketamine Papers, plug. Go and buy a copy. Edited by Wolfson and Hartelius. Roquet's pioneering efforts have finally attained recognition, especially in the community of psychedelic researchers and psychotherapists. Also, Rich Jensen, who I introduced you to a little while ago, has a marvelous film that some of you will be able to see at the conference. And again, be sure to consider coming to the ketamine workshop that will be going on. So, when Salvador came to San Francisco, we would get together for dinners, and also we would go to the hot tubs in the Japanese cultural center. And this is something that he enjoyed very much. And I have many, many wonderful memories, and I often asked him, Salvador, none of this would have happened if you hadn't written me that letter back in the back decades ago in the early 1970s. Why did you pick me instead of more famous people in the field? He said, because I knew that you had a reputation of getting things done. Other people would have come to the session, that would have been the end of it, but I knew you would spread the word. Well, Salvador had very, very good intuition and insight. He didn't even know me or meet me, but apparently he'd picked that up from my writings. And I did spread the word, and as I told you before, I got him to the Maryland Psychiatric Research Institute, and people like Rich spent much more time with him than I did, and he also was part of the psychedelic research project, which enabled him to have psychedelics in a controlled session as a result of not only being a consultant to the project, but being a participant in the project. Well, now skipping to the year 2006. Another dear friend of mine was Albert Hoffman, and of course I went to his 100th birthday party in Switzerland. I'd actually been to visit him and his wife Erica at their home just 2 years before that. None of us knew that the city of Basel would be having this big celebration for him. But they had a celebration, and for some strange reason, I was on the program 5 times. And one time I was on the program for an hour, and I said, look, there are people who should be on the program instead of me. So I invited Rich to be on the program, and he gave a wonderful talk. And also, Linda Rosa Carasone, who was one of Salvador's assistants, was in the audience, and she gave a wonderful talk. A psychiatrist friend of mine from Chile was on the audience, and so I had the opportunity of getting 3 people of color on the program in a virtual all-white, all-male symposium in Switzerland, and I was delighted that I could do that for the field. So, all of this harks back to Salvador Roquet, and now I think that you have learned a little bit about him if you haven't heard from him before, and I think that history will be kind of him. Thank you very much. Thank you. And now I see we have time for a few questions. Because I'm hard of hearing, somebody is going to have to translate for me.
We have microphones in the aisle.
Yes.
If you'd like to line up to ask questions.
Hi, Stan. It's great to see you. And I'm not sure if this is a question, but a comment, maybe you could get a question out of it. It's kind of interesting to me that psychedelics is something that we do to push the envelope, to go further than our usual situation takes us. And yet, over the years, it seems like a lot of the pioneers in the psychedelic community have kind of marginalized Roquet because he was too out there. He was too much pushing the envelope. And I think I've heard him referred to as being kind of reckless. And I think it's so ironic that we're doing this work in order to push the envelope, and yet there's been that kind of, a little bit of that underground attitude about him. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your nice statement. Was there a question involved in that? Didn't think so, but thank you. I appreciate that statement. Any other comments or questions?
Hi. I was wondering if Salvador ever used salvia in his work with the Mazatec or in his psychotherapy.
Okay, now I need some translation on that.
Did Roquet use salvia?
Pardon me?
Did he use salvia?
Oh, he used everything. Of course he used salvia. In fact, every time I came to Mexico, I would have a little stash with me of plants that people had given me, and he was willing to use them in any way that he could. He also used some non-psychedelic plants, and he was just such a botanical master. He would use anything that worked, but he was very discriminating on who he would give the substances to and the combinations that he would use and which one should precede the other substance. And again, this is a testimony to his brilliance that he knew those plants so well, he knew his people so well. Yes?
So it seems to me that most of his interventions were from Western psychotherapy. And I'm just curious, what were some things he incorporated from the Mazatec shamanic traditions into his ceremonies?
Okay, what was that question?
Yeah, Mazatec, from techniques or approaches he may have learned from Maria Sabina, how he translated those into his work.
How did he translate some of Sabina's techniques? Maria Sabina.
Yes.
Yeah.
The way that he used what he had learned, and this is the last question because our time is up, but I'll be happy to talk with people outside. The way that he learned from indigenous people, first of all, if you've been to shamanic sessions, and many of you have, you'll know that they are multimedia. There's dancing, there's drumming, there's singing, there's chanting, and there's sometimes visual displays, artwork, the sand paintings, for example. And so he picked up the multimedia. Also, he picked up the group therapy work. Most of the shamanic sessions I've been in depend upon community support, and there is group interaction going on, and there is group support. He picked that up. And then, obviously, he knew what plants to use, and the dosage and the order of which the plants are given. So those are three things I can think of offhand that he learned from his work with the indigenous shamans. Okay, thank you all for coming.